to be. And the kinds of ways in which we insist on specificity, we insist on contingency, and every other aspect of our historiography, we leave aside when we're talking about capitalism. Oh, bankers will find the profit no matter where they are. Industrialists will work. But this isn't the case. It's hard to find money. It's hard to make money. And these things are contingent. Capitalism contains many different aspects that change over time, and none are as cleanly symmetric as either Marx's MCM equation or the supply and demand curves offered by our economist friends. These symmetries deceive us, and labor is not the mirror of consumption. Labor is a counterpoint to capital, but consumption, as many historians of consumption would like to be, is not. It is an instant of capital, winding its way through perhaps clandestine transformations. Labor is outside this making the movement of capital possible, and treating it as the same, treating it as intertwined, misses what is fundamentally different, and I think does a violence to labor history and consumer history. And we need to understand how this consumption is an act of capital, how it is accumulated in the home, like it's accumulated at the same time in the bank, or in the store, or the factory. And cordoning off this consumption from the rest of capitalist operations renders it docile, and somehow peripheral, fluffy, cultural, just those pretty pictures, as an instrument for other functions, rather as a key function in the operations of capitalism as it is. Now, I think we, as aesthetic intellectuals, contemptuous of mere money-getting and materialism, forget this, but people love their stuff. I love stuff. You guys love stuff. Understanding that is the ground which we need to grapple with. Why people love their stuff, and how they love it and desire it and feel it. And they're not just information optimizers. We're good at this. We can do this. This is what historians do. But it leaves us in this vertiginous possibility. But to understand how we make this new kind of history outside the models which we have before, we need to put the practice of consumption right at the center, and then construct the networks of capital and people and institutions and love and hate all around it, as we have done with labor. Labor history that begins anywhere outside of the workplace loses its focus. To me, it's not even labor history. Outside the wage relationship becomes something lesser. And I don't see why we should treat consumption any different. And the New Deal needs to be at the center of this historiography, because we want to understand how to control it. And the New Deal is the greatest experiment in policy in our century, perhaps one could argue. And it speaks to the great questions. How can state policy on consumption affect the economy? Can consumer behavior be changed? How can business behavior on consumption be changed? How can capital, in essence, be controlled? And focusing on the relationship of business and the consumer and the state reveals a more complicated world than that just of consumers being controlled by or resisting business. This question of hegemony. What changes when we reframe the question, the title of my paper that I was supposed to talk about, consumption in the New Deal, to consumption in New Deal capitalism. Now, I've ranted and raged, but there are some scholars that are moving in this other direction. And I'm just going to briefly talk about these two areas, and there's many others I could have talked about. But the first I want to talk about is the resurgent interest in the anti-chain store movement. Now, a lot of it's coming out of this new scholarship, this great scholarship by Bethany Morton's book just came out on Walmart, understanding how these large companies distribute goods. But there's also a new book coming out by Mark Levinson, and there was a great article in American Quarterly by Daniel Scroope talking about the ways in which people in the 1930s, outside of the New Deal, politically organized to control capitalism. The New Deal was but one kind of political program going on, one kind of policy program going on. And while this anti-chain store legislation ultimately failed, wasn't able to contain the chain stores, the markets did in the end. But this kind of other political history of the 1930s needs to be understood. Understand its relationship with the New Deal at the same time. And this emerging literature is still relatively high level. it's still relatively intellectual policy. Now, I've been told I have to hurry up. The other thing I want to talk about is the FHA, something that we think we understand. Now, the FHA, as many historians have talked about, most importantly Tom Segura talking about the FHA and its transformation of the post-war landscape and the post-war economy. Now, we've largely neglected it or dismissed it or critiqued it because it is so racist. It is so profoundly racist in the way it embedded racism, not just in labor markets, but in the very physical ordering of our world. Now, there's other parts of, now that's true, but we need to also understand the FHA was this amazing program. Now, if we're talking about direct government spending, let's talk about the ways in which government indirectly spent. Let's talk about the ways in which the state can indirectly harness capital, transform the operations of capital itself to make a new world. Hopefully not the way the FHA did, but thinking about that as a model for thinking about insurance. Now, there's also some new recent scholarship, not just on the mortgage practices of the FHA, but there's also a lesser known part of the Title I loan program, which was a home improvement program. Now, there's Richard Harris, who's a Canadian geographer, is going to have a book coming out next year describing the ways in which this did manage to help people spend on their housing and fix their housing. Gabriel Esperdy's book that just came out, Modernizing Main Street, talks about the ways in which this basically remade every retail business in America in the way that it was built. And in my book, which is coming out next year, I talk about the way in which this convinced bankers finally to lend to consumers directly for the first time, transforming consumer credit in the States. But the big question about Title I is that it was an indirect system of controlling capital. It was an indirect way to mobilize billions and billions of dollars that did not have to be spent by taxpayers. And if we're concerned nowadays about taxpayer spending, these are the kinds of things that we can provide to policymakers in thinking about how to control capital to rejuvenate the economy without spending dollars of our own. Unleashing capital in ways and volumes that direct government spending could not. And changing on the ground how consumers consumed, what they consumed, the practice of consumption itself. And now, if we're searching for a usable past, I think the New Deal could not be a better place for understanding it, and certainly not the ways it's been decried in the popular press today. It's a moment of possibility, it's a moment of promise, and ultimately a moment of consumer practice in this larger historicized capitalism. Thank you very much.